Rongorongo is a system of glyphs discovered in the 19th century on Easter Island that appears to be writing or proto-writing. Numerous attempts at decipherment have been made, none successfully. Although some calendrical and what might prove to be genealogical information has been identified, not even these glyphs can actually be read. If Rongorongo does prove to be writing and proves to be an independent invention, it would be one of very few independent inventions of writing in human history. 24 wooden objects bearing Rongorongo inscriptions, some heavily weathered, burned, or otherwise damaged, were collected in the late 19th century and are now scattered in museums and private collections. None remain on Easter Island. The objects are mostly tablets shaped from irregular pieces of wood, sometimes driftwood, but include a chieftain staff, a birdman statuette, and 2 reimiro ornaments. There are also a few petroglyphs which may include short Rongorongo inscriptions. Oral history suggests that only a small elite was ever literate and that the tablets were sacred. Authentic Rongorongo texts are written in alternating directions, a system called reverse boustrophedon. In a third of the tablets, the lines of text are inscribed in shallow fluting carved into the wood. The glyphs themselves are outlines of human, animal, plant, artifact and geometric forms. Many of the human and animal figures, such as glyphs 200 and 280, have characteristic protuberances on each side of the head, possibly representing eyes. Individual texts are conventionally known by a single uppercase letter and a name, such as Tablet C, the Mamari tablet. The somewhat variable names may be descriptive or indicate where the object is kept, as in the snuffbox, the small Santiago tablet, and the Santiago staff. Etymology and variant names, Rongorongo is the modern name for the inscriptions. In the Rapa Nui language it means to recite, to declaim, to chant out. The original name Euro, or perhaps description Euro of the script is said to have been Kohamo Tomo Rongorongo, lines incised for chanting out, shortened to Koha Rongorongo or lines, for chanting out. There are also said to have been more specific names for the texts based on their topic. For example, the Koha Tor Euro were annals, the Koha registered trademark Ka were lists of persons killed in war, and the Koha Ranga lines of fugitives were lists of war refugees. Some authors have understood the Tor Euro and Koha Tor Euro to refer to a separate form of writing distinct from Rongorongo. Barthel recorded that the islanders had another writing which recorded their annals and other secular matters, but this has disappeared. However, Fisher writes that the Tor Euro was originally a type of Rongorongo inscription. In the 1880s, a group of elders invented a derivative script, also called Tor Euro with which to decorate carvings in order to increase their trading value. It is a primitive imitation of Rongorongo. An alleged third script, the Mama or Vor Euro described in some mid-20th century publications, was an early 20th century geometric, decorative invention. Form and construction. The forms of the glyphs are standardized contours of living organisms and geometric designs about 1 centimeter high. The wooden tablets are irregular in shape and, in many instances, fluted, with the glyphs carved in shallow channels running the length of the tablets, as can be seen in the image of tablet G at right. It is thought that irregular and often blemished pieces of wood were used in their entirety rather than squared off due to the scarcity of wood on the island. Writing media equals. Except for a few possible glyphs cut in stone, all surviving texts are inscribed in wood. According to tradition, the tablets were made of Toromiro wood. However, Orliac examined 7 objects with stereooptical and scanning electron microscopes and determined that all were instead made from Pacific rosewood. The same identification had been made for tablet M in 1934. This 15-meter tree, known as Pacific rosewood for its color and called Mako Euroi in Rapa Nui, is used for sacred groves and carvings throughout eastern Polynesia and was evidently brought to Easter Island by the first settlers. However, not all the wood was native. Orliac established that tablets N, P, and S were made of South African yellow wood and therefore that the wood had arrived with Western contact. Fisher describes P as a damaged and reshapen European or American ore, as are A and B. notes that wood from the wreck of a western boat was said to have been used for many tablets, and that both P and S had been recycled as planking for a Rapanui driftwood canoe, suggesting that by that time the tablets had little value to the islanders as texts. Several texts, including O, are carved on gnarled driftwood. The fact that the islanders were reduced to inscribing driftwood, and were regardless extremely economical in their use of wood, may have had consequences for the structure of the script, such as the abundance of ligatures and potentially a telegraphic style of writing that would complicate textual analysis. Oral tradition holds that, because of the great value of wood, only expert scribes used it, while pupils wrote on banana leaves. German ethnologist Thomas Barthel believed that carving on wood was a secondary development in the evolution of the script based on an earlier stage of incising banana leaves or the sheaths of the banana trunk with a bone stylus, and that the medium of leaves was retained not only for lessons but to plan and compose the texts of the wooden tablets. He found experimentally that the glyphs were quite visible on banana leaves due to the sap that emerged from the cuts and dried on the surface. However, when the leaves themselves dried they became brittle and would not have survived for long. Barthel speculated that the banana leaf might even have served as a prototype for the tablets, with the fluted surface of the tablets an emulation of the veined structure of a leaf. Direction of writing Rongorongo glyphs were written in reverse boustrophedon, left to right and bottom to top. That is, the reader begins at the bottom left-hand corner of a tablet, reads a line from left to right, then rotates the tablet 180 degrees to continue on the next line. When reading one line, the lines above and below it would appear upside down, as can be seen in the image at left. However, the writing continues on to the second side of a tablet at the point where it finishes off the first, so if the first side has an odd number of lines, as is the case with tablets K, N, P, and Q, the second will start at the upper left-hand corner, and the direction of writing shifts to top to bottom. Larger tablets and staves may have been read without turning, if the reader were able to read upside down. Writing instruments According to oral tradition, scribes used obsidian flakes or small shark teeth, presumably the hofter tools still used to carve wood in Polynesia, to flute and polish the tablets and then to incise the glyphs. The glyphs are most commonly composed of deep smooth cuts, though superficial hairline cuts are also found. In the close-up image at right, a glyph is composed of two parts connected by a hairline cut. This is a typical convention for this shape. Several researchers, including Barthel, believe that these superficial cuts were made by obsidian, and that the texts were carved in a two-stage process, first sketched with obsidian and then deepened and finished with a worn shark tooth. The remaining hairline cuts were then either errors, design conventions, or decorative embellishments. Vertical strings of chevrons or lozenges, for example, are typically connected with hairline cuts, as can be seen repeatedly in the close-up of one end of tablet B below. However, Barthel was told that the last literate Rapanui king, Nguruara, sketched out the glyphs in soot applied with a fish bone and then engraved them with a shark tooth. Tablet N, on the other hand, shows no sign of shark teeth. Haviland noticed that the glyphs of this text appear to have been incised with a sharpened bone, as evidenced by the shallowness and width of the grooves. N also displays secondary working with obsidian flakes to elaborate details within the finished contour lines. No other Rongorongo inscription reveals such graphic extravagance. Other tablets appear to have been cut with a steel blade, often rather crudely. Although steel knives were available after the arrival of the Spanish, this does cast suspicion on the authenticity of these tablets. Glyphs. The glyphs are stylized human, animal, vegetable and geometric shapes, and often form compounds. Nearly all those with heads are oriented head up and are either seen face on or in profile to the right, in the direction of writing. It is not known what significance turning a glyph head down or to the left may have had. Heads often have characteristic projections on the sides which may be eyes but which often resemble ears. Birds are common. Many resemble the frigate bird which was associated with the supreme god Make. Other glyphs look like fish or arthropods. A few, but only a few, are similar to petroglyphs found throughout the island. Some of the more iconic Rongorongo glyphs. The seated man, bottom left, is thought to be a compound. Readings from Buffel. The captions in the rightmost column are merely descriptive. Origin. Oral tradition holds that either Hotomacha A or 2A Ukoeo, the legendary founder, of Rapa Nui, brought 67 tablets from their homeland. The same founder is also credited with bringing indigenous plants such as the reimiro. However, there is no homeland likely to have had a tradition of writing in Polynesia or even in South America. Thus Rongorongo appears to have been in internal development. Given that few if any of the Rapa Nui people remaining on the island in the 1870s could read the glyphs, it is likely that only a small minority were ever literate. Indeed, early visitors were told that literacy was a privilege of the ruling families and priests who were all kidnapped in the Peruvian slaving raids or died soon afterwards in the resulting epidemics. Dating the tablets little direct dating has been done. The start of forest clearing for agriculture, and thus presumably colonization, has been dated to circa 1200, implying a date for the invention of Rongorongo no earlier than the 13th century. Tablet Q is the sole item that has been carbon dated, but the results only constrain the date to sometime after 1680. Glyph 67 is thought to represent the extinct Easter Island palm, which disappeared from the island's pollen record circa 1650, suggesting that the script itself is at least that old. Texts A, P, and V can be dated to the 18th or 19th century by virtue of being inscribed on European ores. Orliac argued that the wood for tablet C was cut from the trunk of a tree some 15 meters tall, and Easter Island has long been deforested of trees that size. Analysis of charcoal indicates that the forest disappeared in the first half of the 17th century. Roggeveen, who discovered Easter Island in 1722, described the island as destitute of large trees, and in 1770 González de Ojeda wrote, "Not a single tree is to be found capable of furnishing a plank so much as 6 inches, 15 centimeters in width." Forster, with Cook's expedition of 1774, reported that there was not a tree upon the island which exceeded the height of 10 feet, 3 m. All of these methods date the wood, not the inscriptions themselves. Pacific rosewood is not durable, and is unlikely to survive long in Easter Island's climate. 1770 Spanish expedition In 1770 the Spanish annexed Easter Island under Captain González de Ojeda. A signing ceremony was held in which a treaty of annexation was signed by an undisclosed number of chiefs by marking upon it certain characters in their own form of script. Several scholars have suggested that Rongorongo may have been an invention inspired by this visit and the signing of the Treaty of Annexation. As circumstantial evidence, they note that no explorer reported the script prior to Hugo Neiraud in 1864, and are of the opinion that the marks with which the chiefs signed the Spanish treaty do not resemble Rongorongo. The hypothesis of these researchers is not that Rongorongo was itself a copy of the Latin alphabet, or of any other form of writing, but that the concept of writing had been conveyed in a process anthropologists term transcultural diffusion, which then inspired the islanders to invent their own system of writing. If this is the case, then Rongorongo emerged, flourished, fell into oblivion, and was all but forgotten within a span of less than 100 years. However, known cases of the diffusion of writing, such as Sequoiah's invention of the Cherokee syllabary after seeing the power of English-language newspapers, or Akwak's invention of the Yugtun script inspired by readings from Christian scripture, involved greater contact than the signing of a single treaty. The glyphs could be crudely written Rongorongo, as might be expected for Rapa Nui representatives writing with the novel instrument of pen on paper. The fact that the script was not otherwise observed by early explorers, who spent little time on the island, may reflect that it was taboo. Such taboos may have lost power along with the Tangata Rongorongo by the time Rapa Nui society collapsed following European slaving raids and the resulting epidemics, so that the tablets had become more widely distributed by Iraud's day. Orliac points out that Tablet C would appear to predate the Spanish visit by at least a century. Petroglyphs Easter Island is the richest assortment of petroglyphs in Polynesia. Nearly every suitable surface has been carved, including the stone walls of some houses and a few of the famous Moiroi statues and their fallen top knots. Around 1,000 sites with over 4,000 glyphs have been catalogued, some in bas or sunken relief, and some painted red and white. Designs include a concentration of chimeric bird-man figures at Rongorongo, a ceremonial center of the Tangata Manu cult. Faces of the creation deity make. Marine animals like turtles, tuna, swordfish, sharks, whales, dolphins, crabs, and octopus. Roosters. Canoes, and over 500 komari. Petroglyphs are often accompanied by carved divots in the rock. Changing traditions are preserved in bas-relief birdmen, which were carved over simpler outline forms and in turn carved over with komari. Although the petroglyphs cannot be directly dated, some are partially obscured by pre-colonial stone buildings, suggesting they are relatively old. Several of the anthropomorphic and animal form petroglyphs have parallels in Rongorongo, for instance a double-headed frigate bird on a fallen Moiroi top knot, a figure which also appears on a dozen tablets. McLaughlin illustrates the most prominent correspondences with the petroglyph corpus of Lee. However, these are mostly isolated glyphs. Few text-like sequences or ligatures have been found among the petroglyphs. This has led to the suggestion that Rongorongo must be a recent creation, perhaps inspired by petroglyph designs or retaining individual petroglyphs as logograms, but not old enough to have been incorporated into the petroglyphic tradition. The most complex candidate for petroglyphic Rongorongo is what appears to be a short sequence of glyphs, one of which is a ligature, carved on the wall of a cave. However, the sequence does not appear to have been carved in a single hand, and the cave is located near the house that produced the Poic tablet, a crude imitation of Rongorongo, so the Ana-Okek petroglyphs may not be authentic. Historical record. Discovery Yuga Ni-Irod, a lay friar of the Congra copyright de Picpus, landed on Easter Island on January 2, 1864, on the 24th day of his departure from Valparaiso. He was to remain on Easter Island for 9 months, evangelizing its inhabitants. He wrote an account of his stay in which he reports his discovery of the tablets that year. There is no other mention of the tablets in his report, and the discovery went unnoticed. Irod left Easter Island on October 11, in extremely poor health. Ordained a priest in 1865, he returned to Easter Island in 1866 where he died of tuberculosis in August 1868, aged 48. Destruction In 1868 the Bishop of Tahiti, Florentin Apermilsion Tapano Jausen, received a gift from the recent Catholic converts of Easter Island. It was a long cord of human hair, a fishing line perhaps, wound around a small wooden board covered in hieroglyphic writing. Stunned at the discovery, he wrote to Father Hippolyte Roussel on Easter Island to collect all the tablets and to find natives capable of translating them. But Roussel could only recover a few, and the islanders could not agree on how to read them. Yet Irod had seen hundreds of tablets only 4 years earlier. What happened to the missing tablets is a matter of conjecture. Irod had noted how little interest their owners had in them. Star copyright Fen Shovit reports that Orliac has observed that the deep black indentation, about 10 cm long, on lines 5 and 6 of the recto of tablet H is a groove made by the rubbing of a fire stick, showing that tablet H had been used for fire making. Tablets S and P had been cut into lashed planking for a canoe, which fits the story of a man named Nyari who made a canoe out of abandoned tablets. As European introduced diseases and raids by Peruvian slavers, including a final devastating raid in 1862 and a subsequent smallpox epidemic, had reduced the Rapa Nui population to under 200 by the 1870s, it is possible that literacy had been wiped out by the time Irod discovered the tablets in 1866. Thus in 1868 Jausen could recover only a few tablets, with 3 more acquired by Captain Garner of the Chilean corvette O'Higgins in 1870. In the 1950s Buthell found the decayed remains of half a dozen tablets in caves, in the context of burials. However, no glyphs could be salvaged. Of the 26 commonly accepted texts that survive, only half are in good condition and authentic beyond doubt. Anthropological accounts British archaeologist and anthropologist Catherine Routledge undertook a 1914–1915 scientific expedition to Rapa Nui with her husband to catalogue the art, customs, and writing of the island. She was able to interview two elderly informants, Kapira and a leper named Tomnika, who allegedly had some knowledge of Rongorongo. The sessions were not very fruitful, as the two often contradicted each other. From them Routledge concluded that Rongorongo was an idiosyncratic mnemonic device that did not directly represent language, in other words, proto-writing, and that the meanings of the glyphs were reformulated by each scribe, so that the Koha Rongorongo could not be read by someone not trained in that specific text. The texts themselves she believed to be litanies for priest-scribes, kept apart in special houses and strictly that recorded the island's history and mythology. By the time of later ethnographic accounts, such as Ma Copyrightro, much of what Routledge recorded in her notes had been forgotten, and the oral history showed a strong external influence from popular published accounts. Corpus, the 26 Rongorongo texts with letter codes are inscribed on wooden objects, each with between 2 and 23 simple glyphs and components of compound glyphs, for over 15,000 in all. The objects are mostly oblong wooden tablets, with the exceptions of a possibly sacred chieftain staff known as the Santiago staff. J and L, inscribed on reimiro pectoral ornaments worn by the elite. X, inscribed on various parts of a Tangata Manu statuette. And Y, a European snuff box assembled from sections cut from a Rongorongo tablet. The tablets, like the pectorals, statuettes, and staves, were works of art and valued possessions, and were apparently given individual proper names in the same manner as jade ornaments in New Zealand. Two of the tablets, C and S, have a documented pre-missionary provenance, though others may be as old or older. There are in addition a few isolated glyphs or short sequences which might prove to be Rongorongo. Classic texts Barthel referred to each of 24 texts he accepted as genuine with a letter of the alphabet. 2 texts have been added to the corpus since then. The 2 faces of the tablets are distinguished by suffixing a or v when the reading sequence can be ascertained, to which the line being discussed is appended. Thus Prairie 2 is item P, recto, second line. When the reading sequence cannot be ascertained, A and B are used for the faces. Thus at 1 is item A, side B, first line. The 6 sides of the snuff box are lettered as sides A to F. Nearly all publications follow the Barthel convention, though a popular book by Fisher uses an idiosyncratic numbering system. Crude glyphs have been found on a few stone objects and some additional wooden items, but most of these are thought to be fakes created for the early tourism market. Several of the 26 wooden texts are suspect due to uncertain provenance, poor quality craftsmanship, or to having been carved with a steel blade, and thus, although they may prove to be genuine, should not be trusted in initial attempts at decipherment. Z resembles many early forgeries in not being boustrophedon, but it may be a palimpsest on an authentic but now illegible text. Additional texts in addition to the petroglyphs mentioned above, there are a few other very short uncatalogued texts that may be Rongorongo. Fisher reports that many statuettes reveal Rongorongo or Rongorongo-like glyphs on their crown. He gives the example of a compound glyph, on the crown of a Moyuro Ipakapaka statuette. Many human skulls are inscribed with the single fish glyph 700, which may stand for a registered trademark car war casualty. There are other designs, including some tattoos recorded by early visitors, which are possibly single Rongorongo glyphs, but since they are isolated and pictographic, it is difficult to know whether or not they are actually writing. Glyphs the only published reference to the glyphs which is even close to comprehensive remains Barthel. Barthel assigned a 3-digit numeric code to each glyph or to each group of similar-looking glyphs that he believed to be allographs. In the case of allography, the bare numeric code was assigned to what Barthel believed to be the basic form, while variants were specified by alphabetic suffixes. Altogether he assigned 600 numeric codes. The hundreds places a digit from 0 to 7, and categorizes the head, or overall form if there is no head, 0 and 1 for geometric shapes and inanimate objects. 2 for figures with ears. 3 and 4 for figures with open mouths. 5 for figures with miscellaneous heads. 6 for figures with beaks. And 7 for fish, arthropods, etc. The digits in tens and units places were allocated similarly, so that, for example, glyphs 206, 306, 406, 506, and 606 all have a downward pointing wing or arm on the left, and a raised four-fingered hand on the right. Coding: the first digit distinguishes head and basic body shape, and the 6 in the units place indicates a specific raised hand. There is some arbitrariness to which glyphs are grouped together, and there are inconsistencies in the assignments of numerical codes and the use of affixes which make the system rather complex. However, despite its shortcomings, Barthel's is the only effective system ever proposed to categorize Rongorongo glyphs. Barthel claimed to have parsed the corpus of glyphs to 120, of which the other 480 in his inventory are allographs or ligatures. The evidence was never published, but similar counts have been obtained by other scholars, such as Pozdnyakov and Pozdnyakov. Published corpus equals. For almost a century only a few of the texts were published. In 1875 the director of the Chilean National Museum of Natural History in Santiago, Rudolf Filippi, published the Santiago Staff, and Carroll published part of the Ore. Most texts remain beyond the reach of would-be decipherers until 1958, when Thomas Barthel published line drawings of almost all the known corpus in his Grundlagen zur Entziffern der Oster in Zellschrift, which remains the fundamental reference to Rongorongo. He transcribed texts A through X, over 99% of the corpus. The CEIPP estimates that it is 97% accurate. Barthel's line drawings were not produced freehand but copied from rubbings, which helped ensure their faithfulness to the originals. Fisher published new line drawings. These include lines scored with obsidian but not finished with a shark tooth, which had not been recorded by Barthel because the rubbings he used often did not show them, for example on tablet N. There are other omissions in Barthel which Fisher corrects, such as a sequence of glyphs at the transition from line Car6 to Car7 which is missing from Barthel, presumably because the carving went over the side of the tablet and was missed by Barthel's rubbing. However, other discrepancies between the two records are straightforward contradictions. For instance, the initial glyph of I-12 in Fisher does not correspond with that of Barthel or Filippi, which agree with each other, and Barthel's rubbing is incompatible with Fisher's drawing. Barthel's annotation, original Dodge 53.76, suggests that he specifically verified Filippi's reading. In addition, the next glyph is missing its right side sprout in Filippi's drawing. This may be the result of an error in the inking, since there is a blank space in its place. The corpus is thus tainted with quite some uncertainty. It has never been properly checked for want of high-quality photographs. Decipherment. As with most undeciphered scripts, there are many fanciful interpretations and claimed translations of Rongorongo. However, apart from a portion of one tablet which has been shown to have to do with a lunar Rapa Nui calendar, none of the texts are understood. There are three serious obstacles to decipherment: assuming Rongorongo is truly writing, the small number of remaining texts, the lack of context such as illustrations in which to interpret them, and the poor attestation of the old Rapa Nui language, since modern Rapa Nui is heavily mixed with Tahitian and is therefore unlikely to closely reflect the language of the tablets. The prevailing opinion is that Rongorongo is not true writing but proto-writing, or even a more limited mnemonic device for genealogy, choreography, navigation, astronomy, or agriculture. For example, the Atlas of Languages states, it was probably used as a memory aid or for decorative purposes, not for recording the Rapa Nui language of the islanders. If this is the case, then there is little hope of ever deciphering it. For those who believe it to be writing, there is debate as to whether Rongorongo is essentially logographic or syllabic, though it appears to be compatible with neither a pure logography nor a pure syllabary. Computer encoding. The SMP range 1CA80 Euro 1CDBFF has been tentatively allocated for encoding the Rongorongo script. An encoding proposal has been written by Michael Everson. Notes: A. B. Englert defines Rongorongo as recita, declamar, le cantando, and Tagata Rongorongo as hombre que sabe leer los textos de los coja Rongorongo, o.c., de las tabletas con signos para la recitación chieftain. Rongorongo is the reduplication of Rongo recado, orden o mandato, mensage, noticia. Tagata Rogo is a mensajero coja defined as las tiradas a hilo sobre tabletas o palos para la inscripción de signos on tablets or sticks for the inscription of signs. The Rapanui word Rongo has cognates in most other Austronesian languages, from Malay Denga to Fijian Rogaka and Hawaiian Lono, where these words have such meanings as to listen, to hear, etc. Barthel tested this experimentally, and Dediran reproduced several tablets in this fashion. Fisher comments. On the large street Petersburg. The original tracing with an obsidian flake describes a bird's bill identical to a foregoing one. But when incising, the scribe reduced this bill to a much more bulbous shape. Since he now was working with the different medium of a shark's tooth. There are many such scribal quirks on the large St. Petersburg, tablet P. The Rongorongo script is a contour script. With various internal or external lines, circles, dashes or dots added. Often such features exist only in the hairline pre-etching affected by obsidian flakes and not incised with a shark's tooth. This is particularly evident on the small Vienna, tablet N. AB for example, Ma copyright Troset of tablet V in 1938, its authenticity is doubtful. The signs appear to have been incised with a steel implement, and do not show the regularity and beauty of outline which characterize the original tablets. Imitation tablets were made for the tourist trade as early as the 1880s. However, a glyph resembling a chicken or rooster is not found, despite chickens being the mainstay of the economy and some of the tablets supposedly commemorating how many men a chief had killed, how many chickens he had stolen. The conventional radiocarbon age obtained is 80 A plus or minus 40 BP, and the 2 sigma calibration age is Cal AD 1680 to Cal AD 1740 and Cal AD 1800 to 1930 and AD 1950 to 1960. In fact, this Rongorongo was collected in 1871, so the later date cannot be correct. Following the Jowson list, which identified it as the Niue coconut palm, a species not introduced until after European contact. Mamari is 19.6 cm wide and includes sapwood along its edges. A trunk of that diameter corresponds to Pacific rosewood's maximum height of 15 m. These were traced from the original, which has since been lost, and so may not retain their original orientations. They were published with the long line vertical on the left, and the large glyph upright on the right. This interprets the 1770 reports as not meaning that the Spaniards had seen Easter Island writing prior to the signing of the treaty, but had simply presumed that they would have had writing. González de Ojeda had given instructions to procure the attestations of the recognized chiefs or caciques of the islanders, signed in their native characters. ABC image. Other examples of petroglyphs which resemble Rongorongo glyphs can be seen here and here. Dans toutes les cases on trouve des tablets de bois ou des bars tons couverts de plusieurs espèces de caractères here. Copyright Roglyphiques, ce sont des figures d'un amour inconnues dans la registered trademark la, que les indigo nestrascent au moyen de pierres trinquantes. Chaque figure a son nom. Mais le plus de casquils font de ces tablets m'incline à penser que ces caractères, rests d'un copyright primitive, sont pour au maintenant un usage quils conservant sans en chercher le sens. Ma Copyright reports that, the present population of 456 natives is entirely derived from the 111 natives left after the abandonment of the island by the French missionaries in 1872. However, Routledge gives a figure of 171 left after an evacuation led by Father Roussel in 1871, mostly old men, and Cook states that the evacuation of some 300 islanders was in 1878, that, When HMS Sappho touched at the island in 1882, it was reported that but 150 of the inhabitants were left, and goes on to give a summary of a complete census he received from Salmon in 1886, which listed 155 natives and 11 foreigners. Fisher translates Buthel, concerning 4 of these tablets, to judge by the form, size, and type of keeping, one can say with a high degree of certainty that this involved tablets that were presented at 2 interments. However, Pozdnyakov and Pozdnyakov believe that the limited and repetitive nature of the texts precludes them recording anything as diverse as history or mythology. In the collection of the Merton D. Simpson Gallery, or perhaps Mo Euro Ep or Euro Appa Euro A. Catalogue number 402-1, labeled Th1 quarter Th3 quarters Th degree Th degree, in the St. Petersburg Museum. Although this compound of glyph 02 inside 70 is not otherwise attested, linked sequences of 70.02 are found, for example in AB6, and it is formally analogous to other infixed compounds of glyph 70. Rongorongo, transliteration codes www.rongorongo.org. Archived from the original on February 9, 2008. Retrieved June 9, 2008. 55 glyphs would be required for a pure syllabary, assuming that long vowels were ignored or treated as vowel sequences. Other examples of proto-writing, such as the Dongba script of China, have proved impossible to read without help. However, the original conclusion that Rongorongo did not encode language may have been based on spurious statistics. See Decipherment of Rongorongo for details. References. Bibliography. External links. The Rongorongo of Easter Island, the most complete and balanced description of Rongorongo on the Internet. Michael Everson's draft Unicode proposal for Rongorongo, The Rock Art of Rapa Nui by Georgia Lee, Splendid Isolation, Art of Easter Island, an exhibition catalogue from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which contains material on Rongorongo.